The last in this week's essays from our continuing series on Greek and Latin voices. Rhiannon Ash of Oxford University explores Tacitus's genius for military storytelling.
Tacitus was once famously criticised by a modern scholar as being the most unmilitary of ancient historians. Yet his interest in warfare and battles, such a staple of Roman historical narratives and epic, is clear and extends beyond concerns with strategy, tactics and realism. Battle scenes for Tacitus could both entertain his audience and inject moralism into his narratives, as we'll see. His focus ranges from the central panel representing the Roman victory at the Battle of Mons Graupius in Britain in the Agricola to more unconventional battle scenes, such as his account in the Histories of the Roman victory over the colourful Sarmatian tribesmen, the Roxolani, with their extraordinary armoured cavalry fighters. Even if today we may find descriptions of battles grisly and bleak, we should not underestimate the potential enjoyment that such scenes could offer ancient audiences. Tacitus was, after all, dealing with readers who'd been brought up on a rich diet of battle descriptions in classic works such as Virgil's Aeneid. This poem includes the harrowing account of the capture of Troy in Aeneid 2, and at least 3 books in the second half of the poem which contain a substantial proportion of battle scenes. And under the Emperor Nero, the epic poet Lucan had taken creative descriptions of deaths on the battlefield, and elsewhere, to new and harrowing extremes. We also have examples of practical manuals about warfare, such as the stratagems of Frontinus, the one-time governor of Britain in about AD 76, who engaged in campaigns against the Silures in Wales. He put his practical experience to work by collecting instances of military stratagems from Greek and Roman history, apparently for the practical instruction of Roman officers. Yet the work is also meant to hold a general appeal for members of the Roman elite who wanted to acquire some sort of military sheen in the eyes of their contemporaries. Anyone who owned such a military handbook was self-consciously representing himself as a military man, and Frontinus in his preface appeals specifically to practical readers who were too busy to read long historical narratives. He says, "For it's a lengthy business to track down individual examples scattered over the vast body of history." This, I think, is an interesting comment, for it presupposes that there were readers out there who wanted to do precisely this. In the Annals, Tacitus himself acknowledges the fascination of mighty wars, stormings of cities, and routed and captured kings on readers of Roman history, but disingenuously he warns his audience not to compare his own bleak narrative with those who compiled the affairs of the Roman people of old. Anyone coming to the Annals hoping for an uplifting account of military challenges successfully overcome by Roman armies would inevitably be disappointed, he implies. Instead, they faced an immovable or only moderately disturbed peace, gloomy events in the city, and an emperor who cared nothing about extending the empire. This does not mean to say, however, that Tacitus's Annals lacks battle descriptions. Far from it. Yet those that do exist are often unconventional. Just to digress for a moment, whatever the reality, standard battle descriptions in ancient literature tend to be composed of certain fixed elements. These include, firstly, speeches from the 2 generals to their troops before the fighting begins. Secondly, the battle order of the 2 armies, followed by the battle description itself. And, last but not least, a note of the casualty figures suffered by the 2 sides. And conventionally, in accounts of Roman armies fighting a foreign foe, these figures are often marked by conspicuously low losses on the Roman side, combined with astonishingly high numbers of dead on the foreign side. So, for example, after the Battle of Mons Graupius in the Agricola, Tacitus says that 10,000 Britons, as opposed to 360 Romans, have been killed. The Greek writer Lucian, writing in the 2nd century AD, highlights the following elements as basic for any historian who was composing a battle narrative. He says, "Let the historian look at the generals first of all, and if they've exhorted their men at all, let him listen to that, and how and with what plan and intention they have drawn up their battle lines. When the battle is joined, let his gaze fall on both sides, and let him weigh the events then, as if in a balance, and let him follow both the pursuit and the flight." What is striking about Lucian's description here is his emphasis on the visual, so that the historian's gaze mediates our own view of events on the battlefield. This reflects a fundamental concern of ancient historical battle narratives with enargeia, or vividness, where visual elements are accentuated in a bid for verisimilitude and excitement. These writers wanted to write their narratives in such a way as to make their audience feel as if they were present at the events being described. Tacitus certainly takes on board such techniques of enargeia in his own battle descriptions, but in other ways his version of such scenes often diverges from the conventional. One nice example involves an absorbing account of a minor battle between the Parthians, led by Orodes, the son of the Parthian king, and a composite army of Albanians, Iberians and Sarmatians, led by Pharasmanes, king of Iberia. This military clash, which takes place in an unspecified location in Armenia, lies at the heart of Tacitus's excursus on Roman activities in Parthia during the years AD 35 to 6. He says, "Once the battle lines were drawn up on both sides, the Parthians spoke about the empire of the East, the fame of the Arsacids, in contrast with the ignoble Iberian with his mercenary force. Pharasmanes told his troops that they were free from Parthian domination, and that the more they sought, the greater the glory they would win as victors, or if they retreated, the greater the disgrace and danger they would incur. At the same time, he pointed out the bristling battle line of his own men and the ranks of the Medes decked out in gold, and the fact that on one side there were men, while on the other side there was loot. Nevertheless, amongst the Sarmatians, the general's voice was not the only one. Each man urged himself not to allow an archery battle. They must anticipate the other side by a charge and by fighting at close quarters. As a result, there were different displays amongst the fighters, since the Parthian cavalry, accustomed to pursue or to flee with equal skill, opened ranks and sought space for shooting, but the Sarmatians charged with pikes and swords after abandoning archery, in which they have a shorter range. Now, in the manner of a cavalry battle, there were alternating charges and retreats, but sometimes it happened that the interlocked battle lines, using their bodies and thrusting weapons, pushed forward and were driven back. Now the Albanians and Iberians grabbed their opponents, tried to pull them off their horses, and made the battle hazardous for their enemies, whom the cavalry attacked from above and the infantry wounded from close at hand. Amidst this, Pharasmanes and Orodes, while they supported the brave or helped the waverers, were conspicuous and therefore known, so they charged at each other with shouting, weapons and horses, although Pharasmanes did so more violently, for he wounded Orodes through the helmet. Pharasmanes did not manage to strike again, since he was carried past by his horse, and the bravest men protected the wounded Orodes. However, the rumour that Orodes had been killed was believed, false though this was, and terrified the Parthians, who conceded victory. This is an intriguing description if we analyse it from the perspective of traditional accounts of battle in Roman historical narratives. For one thing, the Romans themselves are conspicuously absent, for although the Emperor Tiberius has appointed Lucius Vitellius as his general for the campaigns in the east, the way in which this man operates in practice is to let the locals to waste their own resources by fighting each other, as here, and by occasionally making a show of Roman arms, without actually getting involved in the fighting himself. Tacitus's Roman readers would have enjoyed seeing the Parthians defeated, yet their pleasure would no doubt have been muted by the fact that the agents of this defeat are a motley gathering of neighbouring tribes, not Roman legionaries. The description itself at first seems to embrace some conventional elements. So we have the opposing battle harangues of the two military leaders, spurring on their soldiers to fight. But Tacitus adds a twist, for although Pharasmanes significantly points to the Parthian battle lines decked out in gold, hoping to motivate his soldiers by the lure of acquiring booty in victory, the soldiers themselves seem to be driven by less sordid concerns. They concentrate instead on strategic questions about the upcoming battle. Tacitus often likes to confound his audience's expectations in this sort of way, and generals often emerge from his descriptions as being more morally flawed than their soldiers. I end with a very different and more sombre scene from Tacitus's histories. This work, in its surviving books, describes the grimly self-destructive civil wars of AD 69 in the aftermath of the Emperor Nero's death. Most of the serious fighting took place in Italy itself, so the narrative was immediately much closer to home for his readers. Tacitus, after describing the first battle of Bedriacum, fought in northern Italy between the supporters of Otho and Vitellius, then includes a lavish and vivid description where the victorious new Emperor Vitellius visits the battlefield almost 40 days later. This deeply disturbing aftermath narrative runs as follows. From Ticinum, Vitellius turned off to Cremona, and after watching Caecina's gladiatorial show, conceived a desire to set foot on the plain of Bedriacum and to cast his eyes over the traces of his recent victory. It was a dreadful and revolting sight. Less than 40 days had elapsed since the engagement, and mutilated corpses, severed limbs, and the decaying carcasses of men and horses lay everywhere. The ground was tainted with gore. The trees and crops had been trampled down. The devastation was appalling. No less callous was the part of the road which the people of Cremona had strewn with laurel and roses after building altars and sacrificing victims in the manner appropriate for a king. These signs of present happiness soon proved devastating to them. Valens and Caecina were there, pointing out the significant locations for the battle. From here the battle line of the legions had burst forth. From that point the cavalry had attacked. From there the auxiliaries had overwhelmed the enemy. Now each of the tribunes and prefects magnified his own contribution, blending lies with the truth or an exaggeration of the truth. The ordinary soldiers too turned off the high road with shouts of glee, retracing the extent of the fighting and gazing admiringly at the heaps of weapons and piles of corpses. There were indeed some who were moved to tears and pity by the mutability of human life, but not Vitellius. He didn't avert his gaze or feel horror at so many thousands of Roman citizens lying there unburied. He was actually happy and utterly ignorant about how close his fateful day was. He offered a sacrifice to the gods of the place. In a description which graphically encapsulates the human cost of battle, Tacitus uses a range of techniques to sharpen his audience's disgust and disbelief. This initial slide, from watching a gladiatorial show to viewing the battlefield, triggers a central theme, namely the trope of warped spectatorship. So, passages such as these show that the richness and variety of Tacitus's depictions of battle still have the power to move us today. He may indeed frustrate those who turn to his works with a view to reconstructing ancient battles from a tactical perspective, but his descriptions, which often seem to transcend a particular time and place, should make us reflect on the human cost of war. In 1918, the French critic Corbeau called Tacitus the greatest painter of war and argued that Tacitus lavished such attention on individual battle scenes because it is this which speaks to the imagination. The scenes which I've been considering illustrate this point and show that Tacitus remains amongst the most compelling and relevant writers of ancient history for a modern audience.
The essay was presented by Rhiannon Ash and produced in Bristol by Tim Dee in association with the Open University.